What's up, guys? Welcome back to Break Through the Silence. This is session 3, part 2 of the Betterman series. So if you've been keeping up, we're going through this 11-week course. It's going to turn into 12 weeks since we split this one up. And we'll see, we may end up splitting up future ones depending on how long they are. But anyway, this is session 3, like I said, part 2 of session 3. And so we're just going to get into it here. First off, just wanted to recap part 1 of this session. And so basically what he did was he identified 6 common trouble spots that undercut our manhood. That's how he titled that. And the first 3 that we discussed last week are the dad wound. This is emphasizing just the importance of the relationship between a dad and his son. And then number 2 is the lack of a common manhood vision. This is kind of the overarching theme of this course and just really what we're trying to address, what he's trying to address with this course, and what I'm trying to expand on and share my insights on as well, is the state of manhood and how we can create a clear blueprint for what that would look like for us. And then number 3 was unprocessed trauma, just the importance of understanding how trauma impacts us, not only emotionally, but physiologically, and just, the trauma is just so profound in terms of holding us in a certain way of being. And so actually processing through that is just so critical for our healing as men. So anyway, we're going to go into the final 3 here. So we've got number 4 is addictive habits. And so here he identifies the 3 main addictive habits, or the big 3 he called them, that I'm sure we would all agree with: drugs, alcohol, and pornography being the 3 most common. I would throw in there too, like social media, video games. I think those are equally as problematic. So he says 90% of adult addicts started the habit before the age of 18. And I think this is no surprise, at least to me, and probably many of you out there, that if anyone has experienced any form of addiction, it's pretty likely that it started as a child. And when we don't have our brains aren't developed enough to even understand addiction, and before we're even able to make decisions rationally, especially our prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop until the age 25. And so for us to not have the capacity to understand what these substances or these habits are going to do to us long term, that's understandable, and it makes sense that the majority of people who struggle with it in adulthood started it early on, and that habit has just become so ingrained in our minds and our psyches. And so it's a difficult thing to break free from addiction. I've worked with addiction in my own professional experience, working at a recovery home, and it's just, it's so interesting to see how many people come in and go. Just the turnover rate there is just so high. It's so difficult to stay sober when you're just, addiction is a real thing. It's a physiological thing for the most part. Most people are physically addicted to the substance. But anyway, so I think what's important to note here essentially is that all of these addictions, most addiction, is all rooted in this grasping for a dopamine spike, right? Like dopamine, it's one of our main neurotransmitters in the brain. It's associated with pleasure, and it's just the thing that causes this cycle is that we get this spike of dopamine, we feel really good, then we crash from the dopamine, and so we want more of it, right? So we're just grasping for more. That's why a lot of people who are addicted to one substance will also be addicted to another substance, because maybe you're having a few drinks and your buzz is wearing off, and so having another drink isn't doing as much, so they might try some weed, or they may try even harder drugs, like depending on who you are, some cocaine. There's a reason why we think about gateway drugs, like things that will eventually lead you into other substances, because you start with one, your brain eventually kind of grows tired of it, you need more. You either need more of that substance or you need a different substance. So yeah, I think just understanding that root cause of addiction is really important for how we're going to address how to overcome it then. And really the thing to keep in mind then is dopamine itself is not a bad thing. Dopamine, we were designed by God to pursue dopamine. Like, dopamine is a motivating neurotransmitter. It's something that we want to feel, is that release of dopamine. But the distinction is that we need to do it in a way that's not through instant gratification, that we're not getting it just by pursuing these simple addictive habits, but we're actually using it for good, to pursue something good, and something that's going to take consistent effort in, and something that we can commit ourselves to a goal, right? And when we reach that goal, there's going to be a release of dopamine, and that's a good thing. That's what is helping motivate us, or partially is what helps motivate us to that goal. So yeah, I think just recognizing that we can't just try to stop doing these other things. We have to, in order to overcome them, in order to overcome addiction, we have to replace those habits with healthier alternatives. So exercise, something that will also increase dopamine, but it requires some effort. It's not just going to be a quick fix. Learning a new skill or a language, something that takes several weeks or months, or especially a language like that can take you years, right? But these sorts of things are ultimately what's going to help us overcome those other addictions. And maybe finding a new hobby, some kind of creative outlet. For me, I'm really big into music production, and so that's been helpful for me. I personally struggled, especially with marijuana addiction in the past. And so having something now that will still lead to that dopamine release, but just in a way that is healthy. And this is something that God has designed us for, is to pursue that, to do things that will ultimately grant us that feeling of that pleasure, but it has to be through consistent effort. So anyway, moving on from that, number 5 is having no close friends. So he says isolation is at best unhealthy and at worst deadly. And this is just so real. I mean, this is not an exaggeration. There's actually studies that show that loneliness, social isolation can increase the likelihood of early death. So there's actually a study, I found this online, I'll post the link in the description for this one. In June of 2023, there was a meta-analysis done of 90 different studies on the link between social isolation, loneliness, and early death. And essentially what they found is that those who reported feeling socially isolated had a 27% increase in likelihood of early death. And then those who reported experiencing loneliness had an increase of 14%. And this is a study that, so a meta-analysis, this is covering multiple studies, 90 different studies. And in total, they are bringing in 2 million people, 2 million Americans that this survey is assessing. So this is a pretty profound study that was done. Another study I found was related to men and their level of friendships, the closeness of their friendships. And this study found that 15% of Americans report having 0 close friends. And then in addition to that, there's only 27% who reported having 6 or more close friends. That's a pretty crazy statistic. Almost 1 in 5 men in our country are saying that they have 0 close friends. None. And to only have 6 close friends for a quarter of the country, obviously this is a problem. But anyway, what I want to emphasize here, so he quotes Ecclesiastes 4:9-10 here, which I think really outlines this need for close relationships well. So it says, two are better than one, for if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the man who falls when there is not another to lift him up. So moving on to the next point, so this is the final trouble spot that he identifies, is just being spiritually stuck. So this can be related to maybe church hurt or trauma, or just general doubts about God, not seeing genuine faith in other people, or in particular their parents. So actually he says that this is the number one reason for youth leaving the faith, is not seeing the genuineness of their parents' faith, right? So this is, I think, something really important to keep in mind as parents, is what are we reflecting about Christ to our kids? And are they going to see Christ in us and say, that's something that I want to continue to pursue in my life when they ultimately leave the house, right? I mean, your kids aren't going to be living in the house forever. Eventually they're going to be moving on, deciding for themselves if they want to continue to follow Jesus. So I think that's just something that is really important to keep in mind, is as parents, how are we showing Christ to our kids? So obviously some of these things are self-inflicted, just general doubts, things like that. Like that's gonna happen in your faith. Everyone deals with doubts. Everyone has to overcome those somehow. But I think what is important to recognize, I think, for me, I would say that the culture that we live in has driven us in this direction of feeling the need to prove God to people, right? And it's almost like the modern apologetics movement, which I think, I'm not bashing it. I think it's good. I think those are things that we should be analyzing and trying to understand, like, what is the proof for God? But I think ultimately what people are looking for is an encounter with God, right? So I think that's what is really going to help people become unstuck spiritually, right? This is the trouble spot here, being spiritually stuck. I think the best way to get people out of that is to help them to really experience God. I think anyone who has a genuine faith has a testimony about what God has done in their life, about maybe a moment where they just really felt the presence of God, like in an overwhelming way. And that's what we hold on to. At least for me personally, that is what I continually come back to anytime I have doubts or I'm just questioning the faith. I personally went through a crisis of faith back in 2022, up until probably like midway in 2023, of just kind of going through this deconstruction process, trying to understand my faith better. Like, things just weren't making sense. I had a lot of doubt, but I didn't leave the faith because I kept coming back to that experience that I had with God. And I knew that God was there, He was real, and despite what I was having doubts about, I knew that I wasn't going to lose my faith for that reason. Finally, then, he's going to talk about how to address the trouble spots. So he names these 6 trouble spots, and now finally, to end it off, how do we actually address them? So he makes 3 points. He says to name it, share it, and engage it. Naming it and sharing it. Just again, we've talked about this already, the importance of having community and processing these things with people. So here he quotes James 5:16, which, if anyone is familiar with that, that's all about our need to confess our sins to one another, pray for one another, in order that we will be healed. That's what the passage says. And then Proverbs 11:14. So this says, in an abundance of counselors, there is victory. So clearly, Scripture here is pointing us to the need for people in our lives to help us to process things, to grow in our faith. And so then he says, if you're open and transparent with others, you have the opportunity to become the best version of yourself. So yeah, again, this is just all coming back to vulnerability, the power of vulnerability. We need to start to step into that and recognize that without vulnerability, there is not going to be a depth of healing available to us in order to become the best version of ourselves, as he says here. So then number 3 here, getting into the engaging the trouble spots. Number 1, he says, take action courageously, address your trouble spots as planned, call on God to help you. So yeah, this is just now emphasizing the need to dig deeper into all these things. It's not enough to just share it. We need to intentionally engage with it. It can be really easy to deceive ourselves in thinking that just naming it and sharing it is going to be enough, and we can just do that and we'll be all good, we can move on. But it's not going to help us truly overcome these things in a way that we can be free. As I talked about in part 1 of this session, the emotions that are tied to that, we can just push those down. Just sharing it and naming it, we can do that and still just push down the emotions that are tied to it. So engaging it takes it to that next step where we actually begin to process the emotions and come up with a plan to really overcome these trouble spots in our lives. And so finally here, to finish off this section, something I love that he talks about is the armor of God in Ephesians 6, if anyone's familiar with that. He talks about how every piece of armor is forward facing. And so he speculates then that this is to symbolize the fact that God never intended for us to retreat from this battle. And I just thought that was a really good way to wrap this up. So yeah, that wraps up the rest of this session. Thank you for watching. If you have any thoughts or feedback, I'd love to read those, so please feel free to share that in the comments. Either way, I hope this was of value to you. If it was, I really appreciate you just liking and subscribing so that you don't miss any future sessions. I'll be posting probably every Monday going forward. That's my plan now, is to be consistent, just posting every Monday now. So I look forward to seeing you back here then, continuing this journey. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a blessed day. Peace.